the road to the country is, for me, probably the novel I just knew I was going to someday write, just because of the fact that that war, I never experienced it. I was born in 1986, but it took place, as you said, between 1967 to 1970. But it was a thing that was always in my consciousness because, as I said, I was a very curious, or you could even say precocious child growing up. And I asked a lot of questions. And for the first time, so I grew up in a city in Akure. For the first time, we went back to where my parents came from. It was a village in the east of Nigeria. And I remember finding that a lot of people there had some sort of physical deformity. And I was very shocked by that because I had never seen that concentration of people with physical deformities, And I asked my mom, I'm like, what happened to these people? And she said to me, it was the war. So that I was like maybe 7 at the time. So I never forgot that. I always had it at the back of my mind that there was a war that did very bad things to people, to the extent that you could see a man with just one hand, people without limbs, one woman whose half of her face was eaten up with some strange illness. So when I finally came to the point where I had the courage to write the novel, I wanted to have a man. I wanted to connect the two parts of Nigeria that were actually fighting. So the north and southwest against the southeast. Really, in America, it was the north and the south, right, that were fighting here. So in Nigeria, it was a bit complicated. So the Kunle is from the Nigerian side, but his brother escapes into the east, which is had succeeded and called itself a new country, Biafra. And so he goes on this rescue mission to get his brother back, who had escaped with his girlfriend, and he gets roped into fighting on the Biafran side against where he's from. So that kind of inter that kind of political dynamic, because he goes expressly for something that is more personal to him than a political incentive. But then the war itself is a political war. So how does he stand in that sort of situation? So that's one of the things that I wanted to explore with that novel. And of course, as you said, it's a historical novel that has fidelity to the things that happened. Some of which, came from the fact that Nigeria was formed by the British in 1960 and very quickly unraveled because there were no strong bonds to actually have it coexist as a country. So by 1966, it had already unraveled and the war broke out the next year. I've never fought a war. I've never even been a soldier. I've never even handled a gun, I don't think, in my life. So, but I had to find a way to, have as authentic of a portrait of what a wartime soldier would look like. So I did a lot. I interviewed obviously a lot of people. I read a lot of books, even books about the Red Badge of Courage, for instance, which I think was the Revolutionary War and stuff like that. All of these things just to equip me. But what it came down to at the end of the day was just, it came down to the principle of composition that I have. I'm the guy who believes that plot is in many ways irrelevant until you have the full portrait of character. When you have a character and you ask yourself, what is it about, a man who leaves home in search of his brother, who is in a war. What is interesting to me about that man? Why, of all the people I could write about, am I interested in writing about this particular person? The answers to those questions gives you this portraiture of a character, and that's all you have. Plot will emerge from that. So from in my view, the plot is best or most effective. It's not the only way, of course. There are diverse ways of doing things, but it's most effective when its plot is a function of character rather than the reverse. In another case, you could have a situation where you already have an idea of a plot, and then you just look for characters to populate or people or animate that plot. And you can tell if you're a percipient reader. I'll give you an example. I think of a novel like No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy, for instance, which is necessarily a plotless book. I mean, there's a vague sense of plot. This guy who is a psychopathic killer, Anton Chigo, basically goes on rampage, killing people. So my imagination is that when McCarthy was writing that book, all he needed to do was conceive of a character like Anton Chigo, who has no soul. So when you equip him with the thing that he kills people with, the stun gun, what does he do? He goes into the world and kills people. That's it. I mean, what else do you need? So plot emerges naturally from him as a character. But if you take, and for lack of a better example, I'm not saying that Dan Brown is a bad writer or anything like that, but a book like, in my view, Da Vinci Code, I feel like the idea was there. It was a grand idea. Jesus had a wife that nobody knew about. In Americans are always interested in the thing that is hidden from them. You go on YouTube and everybody's saying, here is this thing that nobody wants you to hear about. Here is this stuff that everybody is hiding from you, and everybody's interest is piqued. What is it that people are hiding from us? So everybody wants to know. So I feel like he was playing off of that. The idea that Jesus had a wife, and then, he just needed, okay, the idea has formed, the plot has formed. Let us find the character who would just go and do the journey. So there's a difference there. So one is character driven, one is plot driven. I just want to track his evolution over time. Of course, he leaves this more quiet and calm milieu, of being a student, a law student in Lagos in 1967, goes into this chaotic scenario of war. So what is going to happen is going to be changed by that. He's going to have to become a violent person, or at least somebody who becomes used to violence in some ways. So I track that evolution. That's what I'm most interested in. And of course, as he evolves, the situation around him evolves too. So the evolution of the situation around him has to come up and match his own evolution as a character. So for me, that is where all these subsidiary characters that you're talking about come in. Okay, who is the person who gets him to soften in the midst of these brutalities when his heart is hardening? Well, he falls in love with a woman, Agnes, who is a co-soldier, and eventually he has a child, that becomes. So when he loses the sense of meaning, because see, the Biafran War was a very serious war. Kurt Vonnegut, who was an American writer, spent a lot of time in Biafra, and he said that it was a war of such scale that more small weapons were used, hand grenades, rifles, and stuff like that, than was used in the Second World War combined. So you can imagine that, So this was about almost 2 million people died, many of them from famine and just being because the tactics were that people will cut off supplies and all of that kind of stuff from the enemy places. So that was the scale. So what you found was that Kunle is exposed to so much brutality, that even though I don't have all of it in the on the page, but is many is implied and suggested. Okay, he's seen so much that he becomes very hardened by the end of the novel, so that without the intervention of him falling in love and all of that, he would be a very different character. So that's how I write. That's how I plot his journey, and then those wings just are attached at every step. So one of the things that I've always done, and I think that this is, if there's any reason why people read me, um, is really because I try to make my books as I have this principle that one of the worst things you can do as a writer is to write a book that uh, will not make a that will be as similar or the same as what you've read before. That's just, let me just put it that way. So if I've read something before, all the things I've read, I want to produce something that is different from them in any form. It could be even a subtle difference. So, the fisherman is a, people say, not me, that is different in the sense that the story of this family is told by association to animals. So it feels very funny when you read it, because you open the book and it's saying my dad is an eagle, my brother is a spider, and then the chapters really is a justification of why his brother is a spider. That is the structure of the novel. And then an aggressive minorities is a story narrated by your spirit guide, so not a usual narrator. So here, what do I do? How do I tell the story of this war? So I had to find a man who is a visionary. So the entire novel, even though the actual events of the book happens from 67 to 1970, a 3-year war, the whole novel takes place in one night. He receives this vision in 1948. So that by the time he finishes the vision, he has captured everything that has happened historically 20 years into the future. But he's still in 1948. Nigeria is not even an independent country yet. It's still under the British rule. British flags are all over the city. So that at the end of the novel, the whole novel feels like a vision that can be prevented. So that he has to go and warn people, oh, you guys have to be careful, because I have seen a vision that in 20 years time Nigeria will devolve into a war. Stop hating each other, stop the bigotry. But nobody listens to him, because they think, oh, you're crazy. What are you talking about? We don't even know that Nigeria will ever get out of British rule. So how come you have seen, a future? So that's the frame of the book. So that Sia guy is constantly, so he's watching Kunle 20 years from the future, from which becomes the present of the novel. But there are times when, even from the past, Kunle in the presence hears his voice. So there's an interaction that breaks the mode of time. So there are things like that that I do in the novel, just to, to give that uniqueness to the perspective, the point of view. I interviewed a lot of people, and one of the people whom I spoke with was an actual veteran who fought for the Biafrans. And he told me of how one time they were shelled. His unit was shelled by the federal Nigerian troops, and so they were under heavy shelling. For this was in 1968, in the middle of the war, and so one of his assistants was knocked down by a shell, because they had blown off the trench thing. They had trench system there, like the First World War. And so they couldn't go to rescue him, because, it just was very dangerous. So when the shelling stopped, about 3 days later, they went to check, him to see if he was okay. And the guy had left the place. I think it was the second day. Then, the next day he comes back. and was telling them that, I died. I went into the afterlife and all of that. So I wanted to put that. I thought it was very interesting, but it also allowed me to take my character to this space where, because at that time, to make this commentary about contemporaneous wars, because wars were happening in Vietnam. Americans were fighting in Vietnam in 1968. There was the war in Israel and Palestine at the time. So he goes into this space, and there are all these soldiers who have died across the world telling their own stories. So he joins them. So it becomes a sort of a universal story of men at war.